Think of, actually, I'll ask you, if you think of plants, if I ask you to think of plants, what comes to mind?
A lot of leaves.
A lot of leaves.
Cellulose.
Cellulose. Photosynthesis.
Medicine.
Medicine. Didn't expect that one, but yeah, medicine. Anything else?
A lot of oxygen.
A lot of oxygen. That's good, right? What's that?
Food.
Food. Yeah, a lot of food. As much as maybe some of you might like to only eat meat, not going to work so good. And then if it did, what are the animals that we're eating, right? Anything else?
Pollen, allergies.
Pollen and allergies, yes. Someone say drugs? Poison and drugs. When drugs, I'm not sure if you think you don't have to answer more, but are you thinking medicines or are you thinking more illicit drugs? Again, you don't have to answer that. But lots of both, right? And then we could get into a whole conversation that isn't for this class about why do we make drugs illegal and what drugs are illegal. Are you all familiar? So we're going to go on that tangent. Do you know why the illicit drugs that are illegal, why are they illegal? Say that again?
Racism.
Racism. Well, there were, basically, so it's not a health thing. I mean, drugs are, none of them are necessarily healthy for you, but there's lots of things that are legal that people consume that are also not healthy for you. So why is alcohol legal? And, well, if we go back before marijuana was legal, why was marijuana not legal? Why is it still not legal federally? So going back to the racism, I don't know if you may not be familiar with this, but who I'm trying to think of how to phrase this, how to structure the thought in my head. Who were certain drugs and drug use associated with what and the who is what groups of people. And I'll give you a hint, none of them were groups of people who were considered white. So, but we did have prohibition on alcohol. We saw how that went, right? But
I believe it was the Reagan administration that really heavily associated like marijuana use with the Black community.
they definitely did. Marijuana had still been illegal for a long time before that,
Interesting.
but that it's along the same lines. Right?
Yeah, specifically they started like the quote war on drugs.
Oh, yeah.
As
Yeah,
a
yeah.
direct part of that.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, my brain went in two additional directions, but we'd be here for an hour talking about the war on drugs and how we have wrecked other countries, not just our own country. Okay, so drugs, right, from plants. But yeah, that's good. So I'm happy because you didn't just say they're green things, right? We've got a little bit more depth to that. My hope is that when we get through the plant organs, you start to be able to recognize those things and understand how they're related, and then in plant diversity, you start actually seeing the different plants. The fun part of me for this class is to get you, so we'll do, one of the early field trips we'll just walk around campus and talk about plants. And from my perspective, to hear and see students start to say, oh wait, that thing there is different from that thing there, right? Because right now, for many of you, it probably just all looks the same. It's all green, it's all got a lot of leaves, right? But is that leaf the same as that leaf, the same as that leaf? How do we sort of categorize the different plants and what are they doing? And of course, we don't, here in Washington, we don't have plants that look like this as much as I really like this particular group of plants. Our trees look quite a bit different. Okay, so we're gonna start out talking about plant form, how plants grow, and then how we categorize plant organs. Plants do not grow the same way as animals. How do plants grow?
So by using their roots, so kinda they have like these apical meristems that helps them
Yes.
length.
So they have these things called apical meristems, apical, that's fine too. Think of apex, think of the end or the top of something, and that's where they're growing from. How did we, when we were still growing in height, when we were younger, how did we grow? Did we have a part up here that we just extended from, or out here? No, how did we grow? How did you grow in
Like a
height
mass.
and length? How did that work?
Oh, it's cell division, right? Just.
So some of it was
dividing,
cell
dividing.
division, but how did we, not so much what's the physiological process? How did I, so if you imagine, 8-year-old Jason, who was, I don't know how tall and arms were not nearly this long, how did I grow? How did you grow?
Food.
You
What?
just got bigger overall.
So we all get bigger overall. Most of that is bone, right? Our skeleton is, you remember what type of skeleton, what type of structural support we have from last quarter? No, don't talk about 212, right? We have endoskeletons. Those bones get longer, and all the bones get longer. Longer might not be appropriate for all of them, but they increase their size, right? That's happening everywhere, and then all the rest of the tissue grows to go with it. Plants don't do that. So plants are growing just from their apical meristem. So if we had a tree in a pot here, and I don't know, maybe a foot up from the ground, we took something and scored it, something that's going to damage and cause scar tissue on the tree, and then we went and planted it outside, and we came back 40 years from now. Where's that scar going to be?
Same place.
It's going to be in the same place because the tree isn't growing in length in the middle, it's growing in length on the ends, right? If you did that to, don't do this to a person or an animal, but if you did that to an animal, that scar is going to move because animals are growing from everywhere. So plants don't grow the same way that animals do. Another part of that is they have what we call indeterminate growth. So we have determinate growth, which means in childhood you grow and grow and grow and grow, and after adolescence, we don't grow anymore. As much as I'd like my arms to get a little bit longer, it's not going to happen. The only way to make that happen is going to be very painful and probably create a lot of weak spots in my bones and could kill me, if you get what I'm talking about. We have to break our long bones, stretch them, and then hope that they heal in a way that's going to be strong enough. So we have determinate growth. Animals have determinate growth. Plants have indeterminate growth, which means they just keep growing and growing and growing and growing. For the most part, there are some exceptions to this. Some of our annuals, they'll stop growing and put their energy into maybe flowering or fruiting or something like that. So growth continues throughout their life. That means that some of the cells, or many of their cells, we call totipotent. So totipotent means that they stay in an embryonic state. Plants have a whole set of cells that are totipotent. Not all of their cells are, but they have a whole set of them that are, which means if a plant is damaged, or you remove part of the plant, the plant can regrow or grow around that damage. So you may be familiar with clippings in plants. So people who work in the horticultural field get very practiced at, well, here's this plant that has this feature we like. So I'm going to cut this little bit of a branch, and I'm going to apply some hormones to it, and I'm going to clone it. I'm going to grow a new tree from it or a new plant from it. Or we're going to take this clipping, and this plant produces the fruit we want, but it tends to not be very robust or has this insect damage or whatever. But then I have this other tree here that grows really well, but I don't really like the fruit, so I'm gonna graft this clipping onto this other plant, and now the part producing the fruit that I want will grow associated with the thing that does really good at pulling water out of the soil or something like that. Plants are super flexible that way. You're not gonna do this with people. Carver, I really like your arm. I like this. Let's take a little, I don't need the whole thing. Let's take this part right here, and then I'm gonna do an incision here, and I'm gonna take your forearm, and I'm gonna graft it onto my upper arm, and then wait a couple months and we're good to go, right? You'll regrow your arm. I'll have a third arm. Just it doesn't work that way. But plants, you can do that. That would be, imagine what we would be like if we could do that. Like this part from this person and this part from this person, and now we've got parts everywhere. There's if any of you are writers, I really like reading sci-fi and fantasy type stuff, so write me a series based on that. It'd be weird, but it might be really fun. Okay. All right. So indeterminate growth, and they grow from their tips, not in the middle. Now we'll also talk about some of the categories you can put plants in, and I do this early because I tend to use these terms, and often I don't even think about the fact that I'm using them. So you may be familiar with some of these terms: herbaceous versus woody. What does woody mean? That one might be the easier one.
Yeah, it's just the structures become wood.
Yeah, so it produces wood. Not all plants produce wood. I think we have some, we have some wood rounds. So some plants produce wood. This is wood, right? What is wood made out of? What is most of this? So chemically, molecularly, what is most of this?
Cellulose?
Cellulose. Tons and tons, literally in the forest, tons and tons of cellulose. Can we eat it? No, why not?
It's a bit tough.
This is a quick test of what do you remember from 211? So we can't digest it because cellulose is made up of what type of so it's the type of bond. It's beta glycosidic linkages, right? Between what? Glucose monomers. So it's all glucose monomers. Oh, so neat. Literally. Oh wait, but it's the wrong linkage, so we can't break it down, right? Very few things can break down wood, and the things that can break it breaks down very, very slowly. So really convenient to build forests from, right? So something that's woody produces wood. It doesn't have to be a tree like this. So what does the term herbaceous mean?
Just leaves?
Not wood. Just not wood. They'll still have stems. Typically, but they won't form wood. And typically herbaceous plants are short-lived, woody plants are longer lived. So herbaceous plants lack woody tissue. If we're talking about herbaceous plants, so if you are a woody plant, that plant grows year after year after year. We call that perennial. So something that's around year after year after year is called a perennial. If it's herbaceous, it's oftentimes an annual plant. How long does an annual plant live? 1 year, right? That's what annual refers to. So just 1 year. They can be perennial. So some herbaceous plants are perennial and they just never form wood tissue. Those perennial plants often, the above ground part, the shoots and stems will die back in the wintertime. So if you're familiar with a lot of the things that are coming up in gardens right now, we probably have, I can't see, I can only see a little corner of the bed, but a lot of the garden beds around campus, I should walk around and see, but there are probably a lot of perennial herbaceous plants that are coming up. So things like tulips and daffodils and snow lilies, although they have been done for about a month. Things like that, if you're familiar with crocuses, any of those sorts of plants that people like to have in their gardens that grow from bulbs, those are perennial plants. They'll keep coming back year after year, but they're herbaceous. The above ground parts at the end of the summer die back. So you don't see them in the winter, and then they grow new leaves in the spring. Okay. And an annual just grows 1 year and then dies. So annuals tend to, their strategy is that they tend to produce a lot of seeds. Grow fast, set seed, have your seeds disperse, and then you die. Perennials typically produce less seeds because they're around year after year after year. Question?
So you have like ivy, brambles everywhere,
Yeah.
blackberry, perennial, just because it doesn't
Yep.
produce wood, but
They
also
are
doesn't.
perennials. They
Okay.
do actually produce wood, they just don't produce a lot of it.
Okay,
So, and not really solid wood like this. Yeah, and then one additional thing with ivy and blackberries that are everywhere, are those native? No, they are not native. They are also invasive, which means they cause problems. We should be doing things, in my opinion, to get rid of them, but I don't think we ever will, because people are still, you can still buy ivy at plant stores and plant it in your yard, which is something that we should never be doing because it is invasive. And then blackberries we're never gonna get rid of because people like blackberries too much. In terms of me being a herbivorous insect ecologist, the thing I did in graduate school was work with invasive weed species. So working in a lab that worked on bringing insects from the sort of home country of an invasive weed to get it to feed on the weed and knock down the weed population where it is invasive. That's the stuff. I didn't actually do that work, but that's the lab that I worked in. The work I did was monitoring when that goes wrong. We're really good at that now, but when we first started it 60 plus years ago, we weren't very good at it. So what we do now is find an insect that won't feed on anything else. It'll just feed on the ivy or the blackberry or whatever you're trying to get rid of. 60 years ago, so the insect that I worked with was first introduced, I think, over 60 years ago. It's not very host specific, and no one really cared back then. So my work was figuring out what native plants it feeds on. But we could probably find insects that would take care of ivy and take care of blackberry. But I don't think you're ever getting that through government approval because too many people would be up in arms, even though they're super invasive. So that's my encouragement. There are going to be multiple times where the term I use is I get up on a soapbox. I don't know how to describe what that means. I'm attempting to tell you what you should do, sort of. We should not ever be planting ivy or blackberry. We should be trying to control it because it causes problems. Okay, so here's a plant. Is this plant woody or herbaceous? It looks herbaceous. We don't really know. It might be a woody plant this first year. That was a trick question, right? But you don't see any wood, so it looks herbaceous. On this plant, we have, there are multiple ways to break this up. So notice on the left side, we have a shoot system and a root system. Now, I often, and I shouldn't do this, but I do, and I can't stop myself, and I realized I've already done it at least once this morning. When I use the term shoot, sometimes I'm referring to the shoot system, which is everything above ground. It's stems, leaves, buds, flowers, fruits. That's all in the shoot system. Sometimes, though, I will use the term shoot instead of stem. I should use the term stem, because a shoot is all of this. The stem is just one part of it. So my apologies for how many times I'm gonna do that over the next few weeks. So that's all the above ground. The root is all the below ground. That's the simple version of it. The problem is sometimes you have above ground roots, but we don't call them a part of the shoot system. Oftentimes we have below ground stems, but we don't call that a part of the root system. So it can often be more complicated than this. But our first pass, here's our shoot system and root system. And then we talk about plant organs. So the use of the term organ for plants is very different than it is for animals, right? In last quarter or whenever you took Bio 212 or the equivalent, when you were going through organs, you were thinking of all these things inside the body. With plants, a stem is a plant organ. A leaf is a plant organ. A flower is this will be a flower, probably. Actually, maybe not. A flower is a plant organ. A root is a plant organ. So that's how we're going to use the term this quarter for plants. In this, so we're going to start out talking about roots, but let me start with the above ground. So we've got leaves. Leaves often has these stalks that we'll talk about when we're going through leaves. These are called a petiole. Not all leaves have them, but you've probably seen them before. We'll talk about buds, and there's a couple different types. So we'll talk about apical buds versus axillary buds, and that determines how plants grow. We'll talk about node versus internode, and then flowers and fruits as well. With the roots, so this is one type of root system. This is a root system with a taproot. So taproot means you have one large root that typically will grow down. And it's a lot larger or more distinct, or distinct in some way from all of these lateral roots. So you have a kind of a single root with lateral roots coming off of it. The taproot is usually larger or wider in diameter. This is one of our types of root systems. There is another root system where all the roots arise from the base of the stem, and then you won't have a single root with a bunch of lateral roots coming off of it. But we'll talk about that as a different root system. So any questions for starters about our model plant here? One thing that this is not showing is it is often typical that, so we see the above ground parts, right? We can see the shoot system easily. It's hard to see the root system because it's in the soil. It's common for plants for the root system to have more material than the shoot system, which is really crazy to think about when you're thinking about trees. But there's often at least as much mass of material from that tree below ground as there is above ground. It's just we can't see it very well because of all the soil. And then as the roots branch and get smaller and smaller and smaller, they're gonna get, if you could somehow remove all the soil from it, you lose a lot of the really fine roots. So a lot of the root mass is lost. So if you've ever noticed a tree falling over, and you look at the root mass and you think, well, Jason just told us that tree has more mass below ground than above ground. That's not a lot of mass. That's only a tiny fraction of the total root system of that tree. Most of it breaks free. Okay, so roots. What do roots do? Ooh, you didn't see that. You don't have a cheat sheet. What do roots do?
Well, they get the minerals and water from the soil, and then they shoot it to the
Yes, so they're gonna gather minerals and water from the soil, and they're gonna transport it up through the plant, right? Why do they need to gather the water? Sorry, more review. Partly. What's that water used for? Photosynthesis. Remember, we've got to split water for those electrons in photosynthesis. So plants are using a massive amount of water while they're carrying out photosynthesis. So another little review. This was what's all this material again? Cellulose, glucose monomers, lots of carbon. Where's the carbon come from? From the air, not from the roots. right? I don't know about you, but I've known that for a very long time. It was almost 30 years ago when I was sitting where you were sitting. Not quite, but almost. I still think that is wild, that all of this material comes from the air. We can't see it, right? All that carbon dioxide. Maybe you're like, whatever, Jason, you need to understand chemistry better. It still seems like magic to me. I understand the chemistry of it, I'm good there, but it seems really wild that all of this is coming from the air. Also, part of the reason I still love biology so much is because so much of it, even though I know a lot about how things work, it's still just magic, which makes it awesome, I think. Okay, so they're gathering water and minerals. They're also anchoring the plants, right? When we get a lot of rainfall and then a lot of wind, what happens here? In the wintertime, when we have a couple storms roll through, our soils get really saturated, and then we have a lot of wind.
Trees fall over.
Trees fall over, and then we lose power, and people's houses get damaged, etc. Right? Trees fall over. They fall over because their roots are supposed to be anchoring them in the ground. When the ground is really saturated, it softens up some, and then the wind, of course, is pushing on the trees more. So if you have a tree that is damaged or weakened or has just grown in some lopsided fashion so it's catching the wind more, the roots might not be enough to anchor them anymore. Or oftentimes it's happening in urban and suburban areas, and we have done things to not allow that tree to spread its roots out very far. You build a walkway next to it, or you dig up some of the ground and build a retaining wall next to it, or I'm trying to think of the things that are happening in my neighborhood where I'm like, ooh. There was a house that put up a new retaining wall and got rid of a bank, and there are a couple big trees next to it. I'm like, well, how long until those trees fall over? That's 2 blocks from me. It's not anywhere close to my house, so we're good. So anchoring and then absorbing water and minerals. Those are the big things that roots are responsible for. But there are some other things. So sometimes roots will store carbohydrates. This is actually fairly common for roots to store energy for the plants. And what is the carbohydrate storage for their usage? What form does that usually come in? What's the macromolecule
Carbohydrate.
form?
No.
Not that macro, a little less macro, or a little, yeah. Starch. Yep, so starch. Often this is formed or stored in the form of starch, or what we call starch. Right? We'll talk about there are some specialized functions that roots do as well. So I talked about the taproot system. So some plants have a taproot system, so having that main vertical root with lateral roots coming off of it. And we haven't started into plant diversity yet, but there are 2 big groups of plants that taproots are found in. One group called eudicots. Eu just means true. So eudicots and gymnosperms. Anyone have any idea what is in any of those groups or what those names mean, or?
Is eudicots, are those the ones that their seeds have like 2 baby leaves?
Yes. Yeah, so if you have ever sprouted seeds, if the first thing that comes up are 2 little baby leaves, that is a eudicot.
Or is that
If-
dicot?
Yeah, we'll go with that as a eudicot. There are some exceptions to that, because gymnosperms will do that as well. It's slightly different though, but, so that's a eudicot. Most of the plants you're probably familiar with, well, actually I can't say that. Most of the flowering plants you're probably familiar with are eudicots.
I have a question. In what ways are nutrition used in plants? Like we talked about water, the photosynthesis, how are nutrition used?
So they're going to need a lot of those minerals to build their molecules. So if you think of, so they're pulling carbon out of the air, but then all of the other atoms that they need, they're pulling from the soil. We'll talk a little bit about plant nutrition. We're not going to go too deeply into that, but there's a whole chapter on basically plant, nutrition isn't the appropriate word, but what plants need in terms of all of the nutrients that they need rather than what they provide. But it's the super simple, quick answer is they're using it to build all their macromolecules, all those minerals. Gymnosperms. Any idea what gymnosperms are? This one you are all familiar with. You just may not realize it. Anyone know the name of our common forest trees? Usually there's one or two. We'll get there. By the end of this quarter, my hope is that if anyone asks you that question, you'll be like, yeah, it's Doug firs. We have Doug firs everywhere. I don't know who Doug is, but it's Douglas fir. Douglas, actually, I'd have to look up who Douglas was. Douglas was some old dead white dude because most names are associated with old dead white dudes. I just don't remember if he was a botanist or a general or I don't remember. There are a lot of things in the Northwest named after Douglas. But that's our common tree. What I get when I ask that question a lot of times is people will say pine trees, which is not true, but you're close. So pine trees are gymnosperms. Our Doug fir trees, which are not fir trees, they're false firs, or false hemlocks, are in this. If you're familiar with the cedars that are common here, the hemlocks, those are all gymnosperms. So we'll go through that as we're going through the diversity here. Okay, so that's the taproot system. So one main root with branching roots that we call lateral roots. There is one other major type of root system, and I don't think I have it here. But so here is a taproot. This is not a taproot, not a taproot, not a taproot. These are referred to as fibrous root systems. What you have instead of one central root with lateral roots coming off of it, you have a whole bunch of roots, roughly of the same size, all coming off the base of the stem. And then you don't get much lateral branching off of them, if any. So you notice that here, we have a whole bunch of roots all the same size coming off the base of the stem, here, here, here. Fibrous root systems. Fibrous root system is typical of a different group of plants we call monocots. And we'll talk about what dicot refers to and how we define a dicot versus a monocot. But a lot of the grasses are monocots. So you're familiar with some of these plants as well. So that's the quick version of that. Also, another soapbox that I tend to get up on, so here's lawn for people who like lawn. The soapbox that I like to climb onto is we should not be growing lawns the way we do because they require a lot of water, a lot of resources to care for. If you live in a neighborhood like mine or grew up in a neighborhood like mine or have been in a neighborhood like mine, starting sometime in the next month, I mean, it's already started, every Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you go outside and what are you gonna hear? That'll be a little bit later in the summer. You will hear that. I was thinking before that, something louder, and you're gonna smell lawnmowers, weed whackers, whatever, running all the time. Because so many people have lawn. All of those are consuming fossil fuels to maintain this grassy thing that people in America think we're supposed to have on our properties. I think everyone should do what we've done at my house. We still have lawn. I have kids. They like playing, we play soccer, they run around, whatever. It's nice to have grass in some places. But most of I should bring in a photo of the front of our house at some time, except I need to do a summer photo when it looks nicer. Winter photos, it doesn't look nearly as nice. We covered the lawn that came with the house, most of it in the front. Our front is south facing, so lots of sun. And we have raised beds, a lot of perennials. We grow a lot of food in the front of our house. Our neighbors, we're surrounded by retirees. They were not so sure. They were nice about it, but they were not so sure when we started burying our lawn. We took down a big ugly tree that they liked, and then, oh yeah, it does look nicer without the tree. And then we buried our lawn. What's going on? There were a lot of like passive aggressive, what's going on with your yard types of things for the winter where we buried our lawn. Now we grow a ton of food on it. So lots of tomatoes, corn sometimes. Corn's kind of finicky. Lots of blueberries, pears hopefully this year, apples, carrots, garlic. My wife loves, I think if she could be a garlic farmer, she would be so happy. She loves growing garlic.
How much time does it take to maintain that compared to like a normal lawn?
Very little. I mean, part of the reason it looks like crap in the winter is because we spend very little time maintaining it. It runs fine. It doesn't need maintaining unless you want it to look really nice and pristine. A couple times a year, we'll go through like a weekend effort of clearing stuff out. And then there's always things about, oh, we need a new batch of mulch so that'll look nice, or we need this or we need that. But surprisingly little effort. Compared to me mowing the lawn every weekend for the first year we lived in the house, for like 5 months. A lot less effort than that. A lot less water too than to have a nice green lawn. But part of the reason lawns are so troublesome is because look at how shallow their roots are. And that's how it relates to this lecture. They need frequent watering because they dry out really easily. They also don't support much biodiversity in the soil compared to other things. And all of our neighbors have moles in their lawns, and they ask, why don't you have moles? Oh, we have them. We just don't care. They don't eat the stuff we grow, and we don't care that occasionally they push up a mound because it's not green, brown, right? So there you go. One other thing here, when thinking about roots, so this doesn't happen, I mean it happens in animals, but not nearly as much as in plants. Plants often have this thing we call phenotypic plasticity. So what does phenotype refer to? Physical appearance, physical traits. And then plasticity is referring to the fact that that physical appearance can be quite a bit different. So that's what this term refers to. So you can have roots of the same species, they can look very different based on the environment, based on the type of soil, how deep the soil is, what the growing conditions are, how much water they're exposed to, etc. All of those can change the growth of those roots. So we have a little bit of phenotypic plasticity is typical in animals, just a little bit. But in plants, you can have wildly different appearing organisms. I mean, not wildly compared to animals, not like they're going to produce a totally different type of flower or something like that. Okay, so here's another look at the fibrous root system. Another example here with a whole bunch of roots coming off of the base. They all arise from the base. You do have a few lateral roots, but not nearly the number that you have in a taproot system. There's another name that we apply to this. These are called adventitious roots. So that term technically means a root that's coming off of the sort of blow on the stem. We call them adventitious roots. But because all of these are arising from the same place, we apply that term to a fibrous root system, or the roots on a fibrous root system plant. They're found in monocots, and again, we'll go through that, but that is special to monocots. One of the things that in the next couple of weeks we'll be doing is each time we go through a plant organ is adding some aspect that distinguishes monocots from eudicots. So what type of root system they have? What does this tissue arrangement look like in their stems or in their roots? What type of flower do they have? What type of seed do they produce? How many cotyledons do they have? I don't expect you to know what cotyledons are before coming into this class, but that's where the cot thing comes from. A little more about root structure. So when we look typically at the ends of the root, so here's the very tip of the root, the growing tip. Just back from that, we have root hairs. And these are extensions of epidermal cells on the surface of the root. Any idea of what these root hairs are doing for the root?
Do they increase their surface area?
Yep, this is all about increasing surface area for absorption, right? If you need to absorb water, And minerals having a high surface area is what you want. So you'll see, you can see root hairs. They can be difficult to see. If you ever germinate seeds, you'll see these. Maybe not this obvious, this is zoomed in, but it'll have a fuzzy appearance by the tip of the root. They tend to not be too far back from that. They're fairly fragile, they break off easily. If they dry out, they'll sort of wither. All right, so the rest of us talking about roots here is gonna be looking at some modifications in roots, some of the weird things that roots do, or plants do with their roots. So variation in root structure, we start with things called prop roots. So here is the stem to this tree all the way down to the ground, but there are all of these roots helping to prop that tree up. So we call them prop roots. They're common in, or more common in tropical plants, because oftentimes tropical soils aren't nearly as well developed as temperate soils, so it can be difficult for roots to serve that structural support function. So some plants will grow prop roots to help keep them more stable. There's anchor roots. This is an easy example to find around here. If you go any place where you have ivy climbing a tree or a wall, they have anchor roots. So these are roots coming off of the stem that are going to attach them to a surface. If you've ever tried pulling ivy off of a tree or off of the side of a building, it's like pulling off a whole bunch of Velcro. It's at least how I think of it feeling. Those are the anchor roots that have sort of grown into the surface. So that allows vines to climb, or things like ivy to climb. There are a lot of storage roots. So if we look at a lot of our vegetables, our root vegetables, that is a storage root, lots of carbohydrates in it stored for that plant. We are gonna distinguish, as we go through the organs, between a storage root, a storage stem, and storage leaves. So I talked about bulbs earlier. This is not a bulb. A bulb, the term bulb describes an underground set of storage leaves. So if you think of garlic or an onion, when you cut into those, you can kind of see the leaf structure. Garlic less so, but definitely an onion. The sort of rings in an onion are the layers of leaves in them. We've got aerial roots. So these are kind of like prop roots, but they start typically high up in the canopy. This is an example of what's called a strangler fig. So these figs, the seed gets deposited way up in the canopy, starts to grow its roots down around the tree that it started growing in, and eventually will completely cover and is likely to kill the tree that it started from, which is why they're called strangler figs. And again, these are common, things like this are common in the tropics. Sorry, I guess I talked way ahead of the text.
Professor, sorry, I wasn't, did you say that root causes that tree to die?
It can,
Mhm.
if there's enough growth. What you're not seeing is up in the canopy, it's also kind of covering the whole tree, and it'll outcompete it for light. So this is not, so these are not parasitic in the sense that they're not going in and invading the tissue of the tree that it's surrounding. They're just using it as sort of a form to grow around. And they're going to take over its space, and that can cause it to kill the tree that's underneath. We were just having my son was just asking about this with ivy. So ivy will do something similar, except the aerial roots start from high up and go down. Ivy is growing down on the ground and will grow up the sides of trees, but if you let it go for years and years and years, it can cover the whole tree, and people at least talk about it killing your tree. I don't know whether or not ivy actually does that, but if it grows enough and starts to sort of encroach on the growing space that that tree has, it can cause that tree to weaken or to die. And it's adding a bunch of weight to it. So I don't know, it might have some impact on actually killing the tree. But it's gonna take a long time. So again, we should get rid of our ivy, in my opinion. Another form, buttress roots. Again, these are common in the tropics as well. This is just another form of prop root, but they tend to be talked about in a different category because of their structure. So they typically will give support to very, very large trees. So instead of having a trunk that starts and then growing roots out, this is their root structure. The roots just start higher up on the tree and form these sort of walls coming off of the base of the tree. And again, this is common in the tropics. You will see if you ever go into particularly a wet, old growth forest in the northwest here. So I have seen cedars that will do this when they get old, and I don't know if the wet is required. It's just the places I'm thinking I've seen it have always been fairly wet areas. So you'll get cedars that will form this when they get really, really, really large. And really, really large for a cedar is like you try and give the tree a hug and your arms are like this, which means we don't have a lot of those around anymore. They make it difficult to do field work around because you've got to climb over, and sometimes there'll be gaps and you've got to go under because these buttress roots can be really large.
We talk about, plants growing apically. Are the growth of roots different, or is that only applying to the stem structure?
It's the same. It's just so apical doesn't necessarily mean the top. It means the ends. So you'll get growth at the ends of the branches, at the top of the stem, but you also get it at the tips of all of the roots. That's a really good question. The tips of all of these roots are where the growth is happening. We will talk about lateral, at least the primary growth is happening. We will talk about lateral growth, what we call secondary growth, and that's the growth of wood. That's what allows this sort of apron or buttress to form. I think this might be our last example. There is another root structure called nematophores that you see in areas that are really, really wet. These are roots that start down in the soil and they're growing up into the air. And this is to get oxygen to the roots. So in places where you have standing water most of the time or waterlogged soils, there are plants that will send roots up out of the soil to get oxygen. And what happens, it's not that there isn't oxygen in water, but if you remember from 212, or if you got this in your zoology class, water has less oxygen than air. Normally that's not a problem for roots because there's actually a lot of airspace in the soil. But if the soil is saturated with water, if you lose that airspace, it means there's less oxygen for the roots, and there's a lot of other organisms in that are pulling oxygen out. So some plants in these environments will breathe air effectively from their roots. So these are all roots sticking up. All right, so any questions about those? So in this lecture file, I'm going to jump ahead. I won't get through all of this, but I'll pick up tomorrow. Trying to get you set for what you need to know for lab on Thursday to kind of make sense of things. And so we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about tissues. And then tomorrow, because I don't think I'll get through this all in the next 10 minutes, we'll apply these different tissue types to roots and talk about their arrangement in roots. And that's what you're going to be looking at primarily in lab on Thursday. So we talked about plant organs. We've been talking about the root as a plant organ. Inside those organs, they have different tissues. And in some ways, this is a lot easier than when we're talking about animals, right? So I don't have a count off the top of my head of how many tissues I forced you to learn last quarter, how many of those I put on the, it'd probably be easier to think of how many I put on the final exam, but I don't remember that either. But there were a lot, right? Here there are fewer. We basically have dermal tissue, ground tissue, and vascular tissue, right? So think of that as kind of like the epithelial versus the muscle versus the nervous versus the connective. So we have those categories. And then, so there are fewer categories, but only one fewer. And then within each of these, we have some specialized cells and some cell arrangements that we'll talk about. So instead of having an epidermal tissue, and you can have, I don't remember how many, it's 6 possibilities, right? 7 with pseudostratified. We have fewer of them, or fewer details. So dermal tissue, ground tissue, vascular tissue. Dermal typically covers the outside, but sometimes we'll see it in the inside as well. So think of dermal, dermis, skin, right? Vascular tissue, what do you imagine vascular tissue is doing?
Transporting nutrients.
Transporting nutrients and
water.
water, right? And we're gonna focus on basically two types. We're gonna focus on water and minerals going together, and then sugars being transported. And then ground tissue is everything else. Ground, the term refers to kind of the baseline state. It's often not super specialized. Dermal tissue is more specialized. Vascular tissue often is a lot more specialized than ground tissue. So we'll talk about the cells involved in each of these, and then you're going to be learning about the arrangement of these tissues in the different organs. So they're going to look different in a root compared to a stem, and they're going to look different in the leaves as well. So where are the different cell types? Where are the different tissue types? How does that arrangement work out? When do you have this sort of central core of vascular tissue, for example, versus these, what we call these bundles of vascular tissue that are arranged in a ring. They're not always arranged in a ring, but in dicots, they're arranged in a ring, versus how they're arranged in the veins of a leaf, for example. Okay, so we'll start today with talking about the different types of tissues, or some of the special cells in the tissues. So we start with dermal tissue, and this is forming a protective covering. So the outside of the cell, but also in some cases, protective covering inside of the cell, particularly in the roots. So plants have an epidermis, or many plants have an epidermis. We find this in non-woody plants. So in our herbaceous plants, that outside covering is an epidermis, and it is dermal tissue. It also, I thought I'd have this line here, even in woody plants, we have basically the equivalent of an epidermis before the wood forms. We'll talk about that, I think, when we're talking about stems. Plants often typically also have a cuticle. So cuticle is a waxy coating. So this helps them to not lose as much water over their tissues. Not all plants have a cuticle. We'll talk about this when we're going through the different groups of plants, but the vast majority of them do. And the ones that don't, they're limited in where they grow, how tall they grow, etc. When they're active, things like that. What I was talking about, or maybe not talking about, thinking about talking about, hoping it was down here. We talk about epidermis in woody plants before the wood forms. We have something called a periderm that replaces the epidermis in woody plants. And then the periderm is going to be associated with wood formation. So still that outer covering. And we'll talk about that, the process of wood formation and what we call secondary growth when we're going through studies. More specialized cells in dermal tissue, stomata. What are stomata? I'll be looking for these when in a later lab. Yeah, opening for CO2 to come in, water to come out, although typically we want to keep the water in, but also to get rid of oxygen. So this is where gas exchange is happening in and out of the leaves of plants. This is dermal tissue, so they're specialized dermal cells. And the way they work is they have guard cells, so there's these two guard cells that can open or close. And this is regulated, we'll talk about this more, but it's regulated by water pressure, by how pressurized the cells are. If there's enough water and they're pressurized, they're in this open state. So they have fibers in the cells that when they're pressurized will cause them to form that sort of C shape. And then when they're flaccid, or what we call flaccid, they don't have enough water in them, they'll close, right? Which is convenient. If you're losing water, you want your stomata to close. So if the guard cells lose water, they're gonna close automatically. All right, so stomata allow gas exchange, also dermal tissue.
Perfect.
Yep,
What
sorry.
was the name of the, what was the name when it closes? You said that one was pressurized.
Oh, so this is turgid
Mm-hmm.
and flaccid.
Flaccid.
Yep.
Yeah.
Turgid meaning pressurized, flaccid meaning not enough fluid pressure. Still in dermal tissue, so these are less cell and more structures. Trichomes. So trichomes are common in plants. This is something you'd have to get really close to the plant to see, or you might need a magnifying glass to see. But many plants have these hair-like growths on the surface of their leaves or on their fruits that carry out different functions depending on the trichome. So these are growing from epidermal cells, and sometimes it's from an individual epidermal cell, sometimes it's the epidermal cells will grow into a multicellular structure. But here we have these hairs on a pea or a bean. I'm not sure, this looks like a soybean to me, but I don't know if it is. So these are all trichomes coming off of the epidermis. Here are trichomes under the microscope. And there's actually two different types. There's these hairs, and then there's this multicellular glandular structure. So there's probably oil or some chemical inside of this. And here's another look at trichomes. So again, multicellular structures and having this sort of oil-producing glandular structure at the end. And these are resinous. These are sticky. Does it? Oh, there's no hints on here. So this slide, when marijuana was still illegal, this was the slide that told me which students I had smoked a lot of pot. Because I'd start talking about trichomes, and every quarter I'd have students who just couldn't quite keep it 100% under control. And I'm remembering two students in particular who sat back by that door one quarter who had been coming to class high in my 212 class, but I hadn't quite figured out who it was. I could just smell it fairly frequently, and I threw this slide up and they lost it. I'm like, okay, now I know who you are. But now it's legal and the social pressure isn't really there and whatever. But a lot of the resinous substance that you are smoking or consuming with marijuana are these trichomes, or a lot of it's contained within trichomes. This is actually these are marijuana trichomes. So if you are now familiar with that. And again, I haven't talked about this, so not again. What do trichomes do for the plant? Why does marijuana produce these super sticky, resinous, stinky trichomes that then some people like to smoke? Marijuana knocks me out way too much. So if you would know if I started consuming marijuana in the evening, because I'd have a really hard time getting here by class time and being functional in the morning. That just, it's the way it works. If I ever maybe consumed marijuana before it was legal. I went to college at Western. Does Western still have a reputation for pot smoking hippies? So you've noticed my hair. COVID had me go back to what my hairstyle was when I was at Western, except it was a lot longer. And all of my friends smoked pot and did a whole bunch of other, most of my friends did a lot of drugs, way more than I could handle, or was interested in handling. So if you think of long-haired, pot smoking, hacky sack kicking, frisbee throwing hippie at Western, guilty, super guilty. Not a lot of the pot smoking, but all the other stuff, yes. And around people who were, half of my friends were wake and bake people. You familiar with that term? Wake and bake. I don't know how they functioned. I'm not sure how many of them are still alive. But yeah. So why is marijuana so resinous? Why are these trichomes here? What do they do for the plant?
For defense.
Yeah, it's for defense, typically. So this beetle, you might think, well, it's not working. This beetle is feeding on this plant. But even these hairs are probably slowing this beetle down. They're probably limiting the damage it does, the amount it's feeding, or how quickly it feeds. These hairs make it more difficult to walk on, and then if this is containing resin, maybe after being covered in enough resin, a beetle like this is gonna say, I don't feel so good anymore, I'm gonna get out of here. Or imagine this beetle trying to walk on this and it's super sticky and oh crap, now I'm trapped. I can't feed on this plant. So a lot of it a lot of times trichomes will contain something that's sticky or has a toxin in it. Which of course is, it is a toxin that we are consuming when we are consuming marijuana, right? But that's the purpose. All right, so tomorrow I'll pick up the ground tissue and we'll talk about the arrangement of the tissues